Emma, the best wedding gift you could ever give your sister is to disappear from this family forever. That's what my mother said to me on the night before my sister's wedding. Her voice was cold, almost rehearsed, as if she had been waiting years to finally say it out loud. And my father? He just nodded, like he'd been thinking the same thing all along. Before I dive deeper, let me pause for a second. If you've ever felt like the forgotten child in your own family, this story is for you. And while you're here, hit subscribe and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I'd love to know where you're tuning in. I'm Emma Collins, 29 years old, born and raised in Savannah, Georgia. On the outside, my family looked picture perfect. My parents ran a thriving real estate company, and my older sister, Olivia, was the golden child, a brilliant doctor, everyone's pride. Then there was me, the one always standing in the background, working twice as hard just to earn half a smile. When Olivia announced her engagement, my parents lit up like it was the royal wedding. And me? I became the invisible planner. I booked venues, negotiated with caterers, designed the invitations, even picked out flowers down to the last petal, all in silence, hoping maybe this time they'd say, "Good job, Emma." But every effort I made was dismissed, every choice corrected. The night it all shattered, I had just dropped off a box of decorations, handmade centerpieces I'd spent weeks preparing. One was missing. Just one. My mother's eyes narrowed, her lips curved into that familiar look of disdain, and she snapped, "You've ruined everything again." That's when she said it. That quote I'll never forget. My father added, "It's time, Emma. You don't belong here." I wish I could tell you I screamed, that I fought back. But I didn't. I stood there, holding that half-empty box, feeling like the air had been sucked out of the room. And then, something inside me broke and rebuilt itself at the same time. Because if they wanted me gone, I was about to give them exactly that. But not in the way they expected. I remember standing in my apartment that night, staring at the walls like they were strangers. My mother's words still echoed in my head. The best gift you could give is to disappear forever. My father's agreement stung worse than the slap I had imagined but never received. I had always thought there was at least a sliver of love left for me. That night proved otherwise. I barely slept. Instead, I pulled out the wedding binder I had spent months creating, contracts, receipts, timelines neatly organized in color-coded tabs. I ran my hands over it, realizing every page was really just a plea for recognition. And for what? A family who had already decided I didn't belong? The next morning, I woke up with a strange calm. It wasn't weakness, it was clarity. If they wanted me gone, I was going to give them exactly that. But this time, it wouldn't be me sulking in the background, begging for scraps of affection. This time, I would leave on my own terms. I grabbed my laptop and called a real estate agent I'd met months earlier at a networking event. "I need a quick sale," I told him. He hesitated, then offered me a price $20,000 below market value. I signed without blinking. Speed mattered more than money. Then came the bank accounts. My parents and I had a shared account, supposedly for family expenses, mostly my contributions, if we're being honest. For years, I'd poured in savings to cover my mother's medical bills and household costs, while Olivia lived her glamorous life in the city. I contacted a lawyer I knew, Karen Mitchell, and explained everything. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "Emma, you're not just walking away. You're reclaiming your life." That sentence hit me like a jolt. Reclaiming my life. Words I'd never allowed myself to believe. By the time the wedding day arrived, I had already set everything in motion. While the guests were gathering in a rustic barn decorated with flowers I had chosen, I sat in my small apartment surrounded by half-packed boxes. A friend texted me a shaky live stream of the ceremony. There they were, my parents, toasting as if my absence had been the missing piece to their perfect family portrait. Olivia beamed, Daniel by her side. Not one person asked where I was. Not one. And yet, instead of despair, I felt something shift inside me. Watching them celebrate without me, I realized the truth. I had never been part of that picture to begin with. I was just the extra frame they never wanted to hang on the wall. So I slammed the laptop shut and whispered to myself, "It's over. I'm done begging." The following week was a blur of decisions I should have made years ago. I sold nearly everything: furniture, clothes, even the couch I had saved months of paychecks for. I kept only what mattered: my laptop, a few outfits, and a sapphire necklace given to me by my high school art teacher, the one adult who had ever believed in my talent. I signed a short-term lease on a cottage 3 hours away in Charleston, South Carolina. The floors creaked, the windows stuck in the humidity, but it was mine. For the first time, no one was hovering over me, criticizing every choice. I even used my middle name, Elaine, to start fresh. But just as I began to breathe, the storm I thought I'd escaped followed me. A week after the wedding, I opened my phone to see a post from my mother on the town's community page. "Our daughter stole from us and ruined Olivia's wedding." My father commented underneath, "We trusted Emma and she betrayed us." My hands shook. Betrayed them? After all those years of sacrifice? I called my lawyer immediately. She pulled up the trust we had set on the shared account and confirmed every penny was accounted for, every medical bill, every utility paid. The truth was on my side. But the lies my parents were spinning in public, they cut deeper than any private insult ever had. I stared at the screen, their words burning into me, and thought, if they wanted a villain, maybe that's exactly what I would become. The lies spread faster than I could keep up. Within days, neighbors I'd known since childhood were whispering, "Did you hear? Emma took off with the family's money." My phone lit up with messages I didn't bother opening. It was as if my absence had given my parents the perfect scapegoat for everything they wanted to hide. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself I didn't owe them or anyone else an explanation. But one night, as I was unpacking boxes in my little Charleston cottage, a name lit up my phone: Daniel Reed, my sister's new husband. I hesitated, then answered. His voice was low, almost apologetic. "Emma, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but something happened at the wedding, and I think you need to know I froze." Daniel had never called me directly before. I asked him what he meant. He sighed, then said the words that made my chest tighten. "Your mom told everyone you left because you couldn't stand Olivia's success. But I know that's not true. I saw the way they treated you. And Emma. I saw your father transfer money out of that joint account before you froze it." I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Are you saying Dad was taking money without telling me?" Daniel paused. "Not just that. He told the wedding planner that if anything went wrong, he'd blame you. Said people already expected it." I thought he was joking. Now, I'm not so sure that call changed everything. Up until then, I thought disappearing was my escape. But now I realized it was also my leverage. My father hadn't just rejected me. He'd been using me as his cover. The very next day, I met again with my financial lawyer, Stephen Reynolds. He pulled up the records, his eyes narrowing as he scrolled. "Emma, your father moved close to $10,000 into a private investment account 2 days before the wedding. Without your authorization?" There it was. Proof. All those years of me pouring money into that shared account under the guise of family expenses, and he'd been dipping into it like his personal piggy bank. I wanted to scream. Instead, I asked Stephen what I could do. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "You already did the smartest thing, freezing the account. Now, if they keep pushing lies, we can counter with facts. But be ready. If this gets public, your family's reputation could unravel fast." For a moment, I almost felt guilty, but then I remembered my mother's words, echoing like poison. "The best gift you could give is to disappear forever." I whispered to myself, "Fine. If disappearing means exposing the truth, then so be it." A week later, Savannah was buzzing again, not about Olivia's picture-perfect marriage, but about a leaked report. One of my old coworkers, who had always admired my persistence, sent me an anonymous email. Attached was a screenshot from a local journalist's draft. Real estate mogul Richard Collins accused of misusing family funds to cover private debts. My hands shook as I scrolled. My father's empire, built on his reputation for integrity, was cracking, and I hadn't said a single word publicly. Then came the twist I never expected. Olivia herself showed up at my doorstep in Charleston. I opened the door to see her standing there, still immaculate in a tailored coat, but her eyes red from crying. She didn't wait for me to invite her in. She blurted out, "Emma, I can't keep pretending. I knew they were unfair to you. I stayed quiet because it was easier. But Daniel, he's been asking questions. And now everything is blowing up." I stared at her, torn between rage and relief. For years I'd begged for even a shred of acknowledgement. Now here she was, confessing when the damage was already done. She sank into the chair across from me, her voice breaking. "I was jealous, Emma. You think I had it all, but the truth is, I envied you. Because you never needed their approval to keep going. I'm trapped in it. You're free. That moment should have healed me. Instead, it hurt even more, because it proved what I'd suspected all along. I wasn't weak. I was strong. Stronger than the family that had cast me aside." As Olivia left, she squeezed my hand and whispered, "Please don't destroy them completely." I didn't answer, because maybe destruction wasn't my choice anymore. Maybe the truth was already doing the work for me, and deep down I knew. The story was far from over. When Olivia left my cottage that night, the silence felt heavier than before. Her confession was everything I had once longed to hear, acknowledgement, maybe even regret. Yet it came too late, arriving only when the cracks in our family's perfect image had already turned into fractures. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a notification from the Savannah Daily Chronicle. My father's name was splashed across the headline, "Richard Collins under investigation for financial misconduct." I clicked the article with trembling fingers. The report detailed irregular withdrawals from joint accounts, misused funds disguised as business expenses, and anonymous tips from inside his own firm. My heart raced as I read the line. Sources confirm Collins' daughter froze accounts before additional funds could be removed. For the first time, my name wasn't attached to shame. It was attached to truth, but the fallout was brutal. That afternoon, I received a voicemail from my mother. Her voice, once sharp with authority, now cracked with desperation. "Emma, you don't understand. If this gets worse, everything your father built will collapse. Please, come home. Help us fix this." I sat in my kitchen, phone in my hand, trying to process the irony. The same woman who told me to disappear forever was now begging me to return. News spread quickly. On social media, the story turned into a storm. Some defended my parents, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. Others pointed out how I had been the scapegoat for years. I read one comment that struck me like a knife and a balm at the same time. Funny how the invisible daughter ended up being the only honest one. That night, I received another unexpected call, this time from Daniel. His voice was firm, urgent. "Emma, you should know. Your father called me. He wanted me to convince Olivia to side with him publicly, to say the withdrawals were for wedding expenses. He's trying to pin the blame back on you." I felt the anger surge through me. So even now, he's still using me as his excuse? Daniel didn't hesitate. "Yes, but I won't let him. I've already spoken to a reporter. I told them the truth, that you planned everything, paid for most of it, and that your father lied. Emma, you deserve credit." I sank into my chair, tears filling my eyes. After years of silence, someone outside the family was finally standing up for me. 2 days later, the Chronicle published a follow-up article quoting Daniel's statement. For once, the narrative had shifted. Insiders claim Emma Collins was the backbone of her sister's wedding. Financial records suggest she safeguarded funds intended for family expenses. The twist was undeniable. I wasn't the villain. I wasn't the failure. I was the one who had kept the ship from sinking, and yet the calls from my mother kept coming, each one more frantic than the last. The final message nearly made me laugh through the sting. "Emma, you've made your point. Now stop this before it ruins us all." But this time, I didn't delete the voicemail. I saved it. Because deep down, I knew the story wasn't just about saving myself anymore. It was about exposing what years of silence had allowed to fester. As I stood on my cottage porch, the marsh stretching out before me, I whispered the words that had become my anchor. I wasn't running away. I was breaking free, and the world was finally beginning to see it. The pressure from my family didn't stop. By the end of that week, Olivia emailed me a single line: "Mom and Dad are falling apart. Please just talk to them." I stared at the screen, torn between the little girl inside me who still craved their approval and the woman who had finally learned to breathe on her own. That night, another article dropped, this time from a national outlet. The headline read, "Daughter's Quiet Defiance Exposes Local Mogul's Financial Scandal." My name was everywhere now, tied to resilience instead of disgrace. Strangers were calling me brave. The very next morning, my father showed up at my cottage unannounced. His suit was wrinkled, his face pale, a shadow of the man who once towered over me with control. He didn't ask to come in. He just stood there, trembling slightly, before muttering the words I never thought I'd hear. "Emma, I was wrong. We were wrong." For a second, the air seemed to leave my lungs. I had waited nearly 3 decades to hear those words, but instead of relief, I felt an unfamiliar calm. I didn't rush to forgive. I didn't invite him in. I looked straight into his eyes and said softly, "Dad, the greatest gift I can give this family is to stay gone." The words hung heavy between us, echoing back the cruelty my mother had once thrown at me. Only now, they weren't laced with bitterness. They were truth. He opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came. He turned, shoulders slumped, and walked back to his car like a man finally realizing the weight of his own choices. As the sound of the engine faded, I stood on the porch, heart steady. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the forgotten daughter or the scapegoat. I was simply Emma, free, unshaken, and whole. And that's when it hit me. I hadn't vanished. I had emerged. People always assume freedom feels like fireworks, loud, dazzling, impossible to ignore. But for me, freedom was quiet. It was the sound of my own footsteps on a Charleston pier at sunrise, the salty air brushing against my face, and the realization that for once, I wasn't rushing to please anyone. I was just me. Looking back, I realized something important. My parents' rejection, as cruel as it was, became the turning point I never knew I needed. If they hadn't told me to disappear, maybe I never would have discovered that disappearing doesn't mean erasing yourself. Sometimes it means stepping out of the shadows so you can finally be seen, by yourself most of all. I thought about Olivia, trapped in their approval cycle. I thought about my father's broken apology, my mother's desperate voicemails. For years I believed their opinion of me was the only measure of my worth. But now I understood, worth isn't something you beg for, it's something you decide for yourself. One night, sitting at my cottage desk, I opened my old journal. On the very last page, I wrote a single line. "Loving yourself sometimes means walking away, even if it's from the people who gave you life. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe one day I'll talk to them again. Maybe I won't. But I do know this. I'm no longer living for their approval. I'm building a life on my own terms, and that's a story worth telling. And to you listening, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever been told you weren't enough, I want you to remember my story. You are enough. You've always been enough. If this resonates with you, hit like and subscribe. It helps me share more stories like this. And drop a comment with where you're watching from. I'd love to hear your city. Because sometimes the most powerful connections are the ones we build when we share our truths. I disappeared, yes. But in doing so, I finally found myself. And that, I've learned, is the greatest gift of all.